Hi there, it's Blair with Wisecraft Handmade, and it's Quilting and Answer Thursday. Each week I share video tips to help us all be better quilters, and today I'm going to answer some questions about last week's video on fabric storage. So many of you found last week's video useful. You had some questions, so I have some answers for you today. So the first question I got was, how do I store my smallest scraps? So I showed you last week that I store everything that's kind of like a chopped up fat quarter or larger in my fabric stash. Fabric scraps in my studio are usually something like smaller than a 10 by 10 layer cake size, and that is a loose determination. Sometimes if it's a little bit larger than that, but I'm no longer inspired by it for whatever reason, I might put it in the scrap bin as well. I store my scrap bins away from my fabric stash over on our bookcases, and I use these plastic bins from Ikea. This is called Samla, and I know that these come in a lot of different sizes. This one is 15 1/4 by 11 by 5 1/2, a 3-gallon size. So you can kind of see the size there. But I have one of these for each color. So in other words, I store all the reds together, all of the creams together, all of the greens, all of the blues, that sort of thing. And I like the fact that you can see them in these bins. These bins are very stackable, so they fit on one of my shelves. And the interesting thing is that I don't have very many scraps right now. I actually signed up for a class at my favorite local fabric store in Seattle, Dry Goods Design, back in January to make a poof for our upstairs family room. And I knew that the poof was going to take tons of stuffing. If you know what I'm talking about, these things are substantial. I mean, you can literally like set a tray on them, or you could sit on it without, sinking down. It's a substantial item to put in your family room. So I took all of the scraps that I had in all of these scrap bins, put them into contractor bags. I had 2 large contractor bags plus 5 large bags of polyfill, and my poof required all of that. So I knew going into it that I was going to be getting rid of all of those scraps, and I was okay with that because, well, a lot of reasons. I wasn't really throwing them away. I mean, let's face it, if I was in a panic and there was a scrap in there that was worth thousands of dollars, I could actually go upstairs and break open the poof and find it. I started these scrap bins separated by color when my youngest was in elementary school, and he's now a senior in high school. So I used to pay my kids to divide the fabric scraps by color. I'd had those scraps for a very long time. They inspired lots of projects that I would use to challenge myself when I was in a creative rut. Like I made my Tipsy Log Cabin quilt using the pink and the cream and white scrap bins, but they served their purpose. So I was totally okay with those scraps going into the poof and out of my studio. So what you see here, this is all I have right now. This is, I believe, part of a sleeve from a garment. So that's kind of a large scrap. I probably would keep that in the scrap bin. I can see it from the side, so I don't necessarily need to fold it and put it on my fabric stash shelves, but this is the kind of scrap that I am saving in here usually, or it might be an odd triangle or something like that. So that's what I use to store my scrap bins in. So the next question I got was, how exactly do I fold the fabrics that I put in the bins over in my fabric stash? So you may remember that the bins look something like this. I now store all my fabrics vertically. So how do I figure out how to fold them? That took a little bit of trial and error, but I'm going to show you how I did that. So what you have here are fat quarters, which are 21 inches long by 18 inches high. And what I normally do is take these, a stack of these, like these are all from Laundry Basket Quilts. There's a lot of blues in here, but for example, this guy right here, which is primarily cream, I won't store that with the blues. I'll put that in a different bin because I don't store fabric lines together. I store things together by color. What I'll do is spread all of these out, and if they need to be pressed, I'll press them. All of my selvages are on this side, and I've got the 18-inch length out in front of me and the 21-inch length across. And what I'll do, it's pretty simple. I just fold the raw edges in to touch each other, not even directly in the middle, and then I fold it like this. Then many of you know about these comic book, acid-free comic book card inserts. I love these and I use these a lot. I didn't mention these last week, but what I did was I measured inside of my bin to figure out roughly the size, the width I would need to have 2 vertical stacks. And then I took my cards and I cut them into the correct size, and I start from the cut end, not the selvage end, and I just fold them. So then you've got it just like this, and then I just slide that card out. And then I will put these in the bin. Now, like I said, I'll put this in the cream bin. I'll probably put these 2 in a gray or dark bin. But as I also mentioned last week, I always have an empty one, so I can at least house them temporarily in there while I'm folding them. But that's what I do. I'll fold a couple more. So if I don't have a simple way to do this, I won't do it. Sometimes I have larger pieces. This is a 1/2 yard. So I would do this exactly the same way. I would bring the edges in, the lengthwise edges in. I would fold it. And then I would wrap it around the same size of card. And often what I will do is if I've got fabrics that need to be sorted into the bins, I'll just stage them into the empty bin that I have. And like once a week or so, I'll put them on the shelves. So the next question is, how do I fold and store larger pieces of fabric? So that would be pieces larger than 1 yard. And I have some rules I've given myself about buying that sort of fabric. So if I see a fabric in a fabric store or online that I absolutely love, I will usually consider it for the back of a quilt. I don't like to piece backs, number one, so I like to have a nice pretty fabric. And number two, the reason I use it in the back is because often the pieces that I cut for patchwork are way too small to really show off any fabric that I love. So if I see a fabric that I really love and I think I'll use it for a back, I buy 3.5 yards. So here is a bin. This is also an Ikea bin. I will link to it below. I like this bin because if by some miracle it were ever empty, you could actually zip it flat until you need it again. So what I have in here is a lot of larger pieces of fabric. Like for instance, this Tula Pink fabric, gorgeous. I will definitely use this on the back of a quilt. The pattern is way too big to use on the front of a quilt for my quilts. And also it's extra wide. It's 108 inches. So here's some vintage fabric. This is probably 2 yards. This goes in here. Here's another piece of yardage. I think I have 3 yards of this. This is a vintage fabric. But I fold these on an uncut piece of this comic book board. I use a whole piece and not a cut piece. And my rule for myself is if I have more fabric than will fit into one of these bins, I need to use up some of what's in here. Because at that point, I'm just being greedy. Might be able to tell this fabric is, I think this is probably 54 or 58 inches wide. And so to fold this, I would probably start by bringing the selvage edges together. So there are the selvage edges, here are the cut edges. I would fold that in half. Check and see it's still a little bit large. So then what I would do if it's a little bit large and I want it to be the width of the comic book board, I will fold in a little fold. Get it the comic book board width, and then I will start folding. Whoops. Now I leave the comic book board in sometimes, but sometimes I don't. But these all go in that same bin. And as I said, if I need to, I use up what's in there before I go out and buy more fabric. So I hope this answered some questions about how I store fabrics that aren't little scrappy fat quarters and things like that. But I will say, if you are encouraged at all to sort through your fabric and get it in some sort of usable order, it will reward you over and over again. I get so inspired whenever I look at my fabric, and it's not considered yet another task that I have to do. So I hope that inspired you. As always, you can find more tips, inspiration, patterns, and how-tos at my website, wisecrafthandmade.com. Be sure to subscribe to my channel on YouTube or on IGTV to get each week's new video. And I will see you next week.